conducting an unprovoked attack on a country, a sovereign country.
Are they?
Yes, they are.
Really? They're worried we're going to attack Britain, France, Germany?
No,
any democracy?
No, because...
Any decent regime?
No, the United States doesn't usually... No, I said strong countries.
Well, I was asking decent countries.
I don't know
Are
what
people
you would
really
call,
worried the U.S. is going to go, a decent, law-abiding country, and the U.S. is going to come in and say, we don't like the look of you, we're going to depose you? Is that something the U.S. has done quite often? How many countries has the U.S. attacked in the last 15 years?
Well, since World War II, there have been 72 interventions by the United States.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
That's ludicrous.
Well, it's not ludicrous, it's true.
These are some of the countries where the United States, directly and indirectly, has overthrown governments, manipulated elections, and attacked popular movements since 1945. Bush's war on terror is just another brand name replacing the Red Menace as justification for a systematic aggression. This is well documented, yet it remains a kind of secret history, seldom reported in the West as a war of terror. Take just one decade, the 1970s. September the 11th, 1973, is not an anniversary many of us remember. On that day, the United States helped engineer the overthrow of the democratic government of Chile. More than 30,000 people were killed, including the elected president, Salvador Allende. In Southeast Asia, American bombers killed hundreds of thousands in Cambodia and Laos. In Vietnam, the United States sprayed a chemical poison called Agent Orange, a weapon of mass destruction. Today, its effects still cause death and birth deformities. In Indonesia and East Timor, America's backing of the dictatorship of General Suharto led to as many as 1 million deaths.
The U.S. government multiplied its aid to Indonesia as the slaughter in East Timor was occurring. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. You know, the United States ranks pretty high, unfortunately, in supporting leaders and governments that brutalize their own people.
Last year, the Bush administration released its national security strategy. Behind the jargon of the war on terror is a new message that America intends to stand alone and dominate by threat of force.
It reminds you, I think, of the days of the 50s when children were told to go under their desks because an atomic bomb might hit them or something. I mean, it's just ludicrous what's going on. And the whole twist of dragging Iraq into the war of terrorism, the axis of evil, all of this fundamental sort of rubbish, you might say, is part of the political games that have been played by Bush, given the opportunity that 9/11 presented to him and his regime and the survival thereof and the future thereof for the next election in 2004.
Today, the United States has 152 military bases around the world. These include bases at major sources of energy, established under cover of the war on terror. The U.S. military calls this full-spectrum dominance.
We don't really give a damn what anybody thinks. We rub everyone's face in it. We're Americans and you're not. And we're talking the Roman Empire here. I mean, we'll do anything we want to do, anywhere we want to do it. And you're either with us or against us. And multilateral institutions like the UN are incidental and irrelevant to the powers that be. That is the image we're sending to the world. That is what much of the world feels about this country right this minute.
We cannot accept, and we will not accept, states that harbor, finance, train, or equip the agents of terror. Those nations that violate this principle will be regarded as hostile regimes.
How ironic are Bush's words, because thousands of known terrorists are to be found in the United States living beyond the law. Last year, Amnesty International confirmed the presence of thousands of torturers given safe haven in the United States. The report listed notorious names from Latin America, Many of them trained here at the School of Americas in the state of Georgia, where American officers used manuals like this to teach the black arts of terror and repression. Most Americans are completely unaware of this.
You know, you looked at the Truth Commission report in El Salvador, who was responsible for the massacres. Very high percentage of them were trained in at the School of the Americas in Georgia. And down, not just in El Salvador, in Panama, in Honduras, in Guatemala. You go, as I have, you go and meet with the high command of the military in Central America, and you see on their walls diplomas from the School of Americas and other U.S. institutions. So when people talk about terrorism, it's always over there. It's not the terrorists that the United States have supported.
We have done more throughout our history, and since World War II in particular, I think, to create conditions in which individuals can be free around the world than any other country in history.
In Afghanistan, Colonel Rod Davis is helping to spread that message of individual freedom.
Good morning, I'm Colonel Rod Davis. I'm the Director of Public Affairs for CJTF 180. That's the coalition military force stationed here in Afghanistan, specifically at Bagram Air Base. This morning, what we're going to do is take you on a tour of Bagram Air Base, and we're going to tour numerous facilities. The airfield itself will point out...
This is Bagram Air Base near Kabul. It's here that Al-Qaeda suspects are interrogated and disappear, and where there have been allegations of torture. Many of them end up in Camp X-Ray at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba.
What happens, Colonel, to innocent people who are swept up in this? People who have come through your detention facility here at Bagram, but there really isn't a case to be made against them, and they've kind of disappeared.
Well, let's talk about what you refer to as the detention facility. We'll hold right there, allow you to get some images.
How would you describe it if it's not a detention facility?
Tell you what, we'll talk about that. Let's pull off to the side here and let you take a few images.
Oh, this is it over here, is it?
Well, we'll let you know.
Okay.
What I can assure you and your public of is this. That anyone that's under custody, any of the holding locations, they're attended to medically. Medical care is provided. They're fed. They're looked after. There's no abuse or torture that goes on inside of any of these holding facilities.
Well, there have been allegations of torture, haven't there? Particularly, there's a military pathologist who actually described the death in custody of a man here. I think his name was Delaware, who she described it as homicide, murder. You know that case?
I'm aware of the allegation. And what I'll say to you is I think anyone who's fair would have to say that Americans in particular, but certainly members of the coalition, aren't known for committing atrocities. That's not something that's part of our history. It's not the way we do business. It's not the way we treat people.
If you were arrested in the United States by a foreign army and brought to a holding facility, wouldn't you expect to have certain basic rights? That is, access to lawyers, access to people outside, not just simply to literally disappear?
Well, you talked about status before, and as I said, it's rather complicated. And I guess there's some type of continuum or spectrum, if you will. You know, probably prisoners of war off to the far left or right, depending on your perspective, and something less than that to the far other end. We're somewhere on that spectrum.
Yeah.
Somewhere on that spectrum is this man. Wazir Muhammad is a Kabul taxi driver who disappeared into Bagram in April last year. He's now in Guantanamo Bay. He's not been charged with anything. His crime was to inquire after a friend, another taxi driver, who was arrested and who has since been released. What makes this case so appalling is that this man is recognized by the present government as having resisted the Taliban. This is his brother Taj Muhammad, a nurse. This is where he is now, Guantanamo Bay, where prisoners are shackled, trussed, and kept in cages 8 feet by 7 feet for up to 24 hours a day. The light is always on. Children and old men have been incarcerated. Amnesty International calls it a black hole, a violation of the most basic human rights. There are 9 British citizens here, including this man, Shafiq Rasool from the West Midlands, who was effectively kidnapped by the Americans 2 weeks after he'd arrived in Pakistan, where he has relatives. That was almost 2 years ago. Since then, his family has pleaded for help from the British government, but still, he's been charged with nothing. These are the oil fields of the Middle East, the greatest prize of all. Iraq is the world's second biggest oil producer, and its conquest gives America a vast base from which to dominate the Middle East. It's been a conquest achieved at any price, including truth.
It was serious dishonesty, the result of which includes the fact that thousands of Iraqis have died. Hundreds of soldiers from our own countries have tragically died.
Andrew Wilkie is the only serving Western intelligence officer to break cover and expose what he believes to be the truth about the invasion of Iraq. Working in the top-secret Office of National Assessments in Canberra, he saw intelligence shared by America, Britain and Australia.
We were sold this war on the basis of Iraq possessing a massive arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, which was never found and won't be found because there was no massive arsenal of weapons. We were also promised a need for a war on the basis of active cooperation between Iraq and al-Qaeda, and the fact that it was just a matter of time before some of these weapons from this massive arsenal were passed to this terrorist group. Always a ridiculous proposition, and always completely at odds with my experience in the intelligence community that there was no hard intelligence to establish that there was a link between Iraq and al-Qaeda.
You know, I never saw any evidence that would link it, and thus far there's been no evidence produced that would suggest that Saddam was behind al-Qaeda. In fact, my experience in the time I served would suggest the opposite, that Saddam was the least likely person to want anything to do with al-Qaeda. The only reason to have gone to war was to deal with a threat so imminent and so dangerous that war, as a last resort, was the only means available. As I weighed the evidence, as I watched the debate emerge, I reflected on my own experiences, I listened to the discussions from the Pentagon and inside the White House, as I checked with sources in Congress and people who were current on the intelligence. That simply wasn't the case.
Isn't there a problem for us in the West of honesty about the reason for going to war in Iraq, and that was weapons of mass destruction?
I don't think that was a lie. We went to war in large part because of the concern that weapons of mass destruction in the hands of the Saddam Hussein regime, a regime that used such weapons, in particular nerve gas.
And was supplied by the United States and Britain with these weapons of mass destruction.
No, I don't believe that's accurate.
Well, yes, they were. Most of the weapons of mass destruction from Saddam Hussein weren't built by him. The machine tools and the ingredients for his biological weapons, they all came from other countries, many of them from this country and Britain.
I don't think that's right. I really think that
it's on the record in the Library of Congress. You'll find it there.
I think the premise of your question is wrong.
Mr. Fife had only to look up this congressional record of a US Senate inquiry in 1992. It shows that the US government approved the sale of biological weapons to Saddam Hussein. The suppliers were this company in Maryland and Porton Down in Britain. If you really want to know the truth about the state of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction before the invasion, listen to Colin Powell in February 2001. He states clearly that there was no threat from Saddam Hussein.
He has not developed any significant capability with respect to weapons of mass destruction. He is unable to project conventional power against his neighbors.
And this is Condoleezza Rice, Bush's national security advisor, in July of the same year, saying the same thing, putting the lie to their own propaganda.
We are able to keep arms from him. His military forces have not been rebuilt.
And that, many believe, was the truth, a truth that was covered up and conveniently forgotten after September the 11th, when Bush and Blair decided to attack Iraq. They found no weapons of mass destruction, no links with al-Qaeda, no nuclear weapons, no 45-minute threat.
So was it all a charade?
It was 95% charade.
A charade indeed. The invasion had been planned long ago. In July last year, Condoleezza Rice told another Bush official, "That decision has been made. Don't waste your breath." This is not what Bush told the American people. It's this that makes the inquiry in London by Lord Hutton look like a dramatic diversion. Its narrow terms preventing a far-reaching investigation, not only into the loss of one life, but thousands of lives of innocent people in Iraq, the victims of an unprovoked war. It's now reliably estimated that up to 10,000 civilians may have died in the attack on Iraq. Joe Wilding, a human rights observer in Baghdad during the bombing, saw the suffering.
I and a few other observers were being taken around the hospital by one of the doctors, and he was introducing us to some civilian casualties from the previous day, and he was called away to the emergency room. So he took us with him, and as we walked in, there was a woman probably in her mid-30s, just screaming over and over, "We're farmers, we're farmers." And she had a little boy in her arms. He was 4, his name was Mohammed, and the whole right-hand side of his face was cut up by shrapnel. And then there were other women in there. There was a little girl, and she was just screaming every time anyone moved her, screaming when they took her into the X-ray room, screaming when they brought her out again. And the doctor pulled back the covers and showed us this huge gouge out of her thigh, and they were trying to clean it, and they didn't have enough anaesthetics or painkillers or anything, so she was just screaming and screaming as they tried to clean this wound. All of them were just in so much pain, and then Fateh, the youngest of the daughters, was 8, and she was killed in the bombing, and Fadma was just stained with all their blood and just going from one to another, picking them up.
Why is it wrong for dictators and terrorists to kill innocent civilians, and right or excusable for the United States to do exactly the same?
Well, the United States doesn't do it, and if we did it, it would be as reprehensible as what the terrorists do.
The United States doesn't kill innocent civilians?
No, the United States does not target civilians.
Those of us on the outside who look at September the 11th, where 3,000 people died in that tragedy, but then look at the thousands who have died since, wonder about double standards here. Would you address that?
I think that the numbers that you're talking about are questionable. So let's leave aside your numbers.
Why are they questionable?
I mean, I don't accept your assertion that we've killed thousands of innocent people. But let me get to the.
There's a lot of studies and an examination of facts on the ground
that suggest indeed thousands. I mean, in Iraq at the moment, there are studies that are talking about 10,000, but I don't want to get into numbers, but certainly thousands seems a fair figure.
I don't know that that's true, and I don't accept the assertion.
If you ask an American student how many people died in Vietnam, he'll tell you 58,000, because they've dismissed the 2, 3, maybe 4 million Vietnamese who were killed by the United States and its allies in that war. So this is an ongoing issue. Mr. Powell, Colin Powell, General Colin Powell, I think, was quoted as having said he's not interested in civilian casualties in Afghanistan. It's not his concern. And that's the attitude, I think, with Iraq. Whether it's 5,000 or 10,000, it's really not an issue.
Well, I think Americans, like most people, are mostly concerned about their own countrymen. I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare. One of the stunning things about the quick coalition victory was how little damage was done to Iraqi infrastructure and how low Iraqi casualties were. And I think
that's quite high if it's 10,000 civilians.
Well, I think it's quite low if you look at the size of the military operation that was undertaken.
It's practically an inevitability in war that there are going to be innocent people who get hurt, no matter how a professional military, a properly behaved military, puts into avoiding damage to non-combatants and to civilian infrastructure.
Mr. Fife, that sounds fine, sitting here in Washington. But in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which is my most recent experience, that's not how it looks at all.
May I interrupt for a moment? I apologize, sir. Would you stop tape, please?